Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, great, great. Well, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. We have Dan Kovalik, who's a labor lawyer, writer, and activist. I looked at your website, some amazing stuff, just an incredible background.
Well,
So
thank you.
you've written numerous books. There's a lot to talk about, but I figured you worked on the alien tort case against Coca-Cola in Colombia.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
okay, I wonder if you could just briefly talk about what that was all about, what happened there, what were the crimes of Coca-Cola in Colombia?
Well, the allegations were that there were various Coke bottlers in Colombia that, amongst other things, worked with paramilitary groups to attack trade unionists, including in one case to kill a trade unionist named Isidro Hill
Okay,
at a Coke bottler in Carepa, Colombia. So that's what
okay,
uh, that
okay,
involved.
right, okay. How did the case turn out?
Well, we lost ultimately,
Uh,
um, sadly. Um, if you want to learn more about the case, there's actually a film about it called The Coca-Cola Case. But the long and short of it is we lost.
okay, that's too bad. What is the situation in Colombia today? They have a new president who's apparently a moderate leftist. Do you see any hope in Colombia, or is it just the same old?
No, I see hope, of course. And I'm friends with that president, Gustavo Petro. And I think he's going to try to work very cautiously, but progressively to change that country, which has been dominated by the paramilitary and these paramilitary death squads for decades. So it's going to be a hard thing, a hard nut to crack for him. But yeah, I see hope. I see him being elected and that he even was allowed to take office is hope. So yeah, certainly
Okay,
there's
interesting.
hope.
Okay, cool. What's your take on the situation in Peru? Pedro Castillo was apparently overthrown in a coup. What's your take on Castillo or what's happening there?
Well, I agree with President Gustavo Petro, who said it was a coup. He opposes it and says that ultimately Castillo was overthrown and put in jail because he was poor and because he defends poor people, and I think that's kind of the gist of it, that he was overthrown because he is wants to have social reforms, progressive reforms, and so yes,
Okay.
I oppose the coup. I support the calls in Peru for his immediate reinstatement as president.
Okay, great. Now, interesting. Okay, now you were in Russia recently. You were in
Yes,
Moscow, and you were also in the Donbas. You shared some of the stuff on Facebook and elsewhere. Really,
yes.
your posts were really fascinating. I lived in Moscow myself for 3 years in the late
Wow.
'90s, on and off. I taught English to Russian business people. It was a lot different back then. What I'm hearing is it's much different. Like Moscow, apparently there's a brew pub scene, the craft beer scene. There's Moscow pizza rivals Chicago pizza for whatever that's worth. What do you see in Moscow today? Is it prosperous? What's the feel? What is the feeling you got?
Yeah, it's incredibly prosperous. First of all, as I understand, especially in the early '90s, I mean, Moscow was just crime-ridden, gang-ridden
Right, right.
after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it's so different now. It's clean, orderly, beautiful, as you say. I mean, a vibrant restaurant scene and cafe scene, and boy, it's a place I wouldn't mind living. I'll tell you that. Much nicer than cities in the U.S., frankly.
Right, right.
Their metros, you could eat off the,
Oh, the subway, yeah. So even when I was there, the subway is amazing there. The Moscow Metro. It's like a cathedral.
incredible. Most of that was made during the Soviet Union, of
Right,
course, and they're like museums.
right, right.
It's funny. A friend of mine who should know better, he said to me at some point, he said, "Oh, the Soviets didn't care about beauty," but it's such a ridiculous statement because the buildings are, many of the buildings and the metro in Moscow were built during the Soviet era, and they're absolutely beautiful.
Right, right.
even the Stalin era buildings. I like those, the big, Seven
The,
Sisters, and
right, the Stalin Gothic, they call it.
yeah, they're gorgeous.
Yeah, yeah, MGU,
Uh,
the others,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So, but Moscow's a great place to be. And I was also in St. Petersburg. I still call it Leningrad. You can see
Right.
Comrade Lenin there in the
Yes.
background.
Okay.
And St. Petersburg is just unbelievable. I
Yeah, yeah, it's a beautiful
mean,
city.
that's the jewel, the crown jewel of Russia, I would say, from what people say. Everyone says St. Petersburg's the place to be. Yeah, it's a great place, amazing place.
Wow, cool. What's the feeling of the people there? Do they support Putin, or how do they feel about Putin or about the Ukraine war?
Yeah, well, the polls show, of course, that he has almost 80% approval. And a lot of that is because of the war. I think that people feel, look, I think the prevailing view is that the West is using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, that Russia has been under an existential threat, is under an existential threat from NATO, and that if they had not taken the war to Ukraine, that the war would have been taken to them. And this is a country I think people don't really understand, even if they know intellectually, they don't really understand the mentality of people in Russia, a country that's been invaded multiple times over many centuries. But if we begin even with the Napoleonic invasion in the early 1800s, which got all the way to Moscow, the only way they defeated him was by burning down Moscow. The Muscovites burned down their own city. And then of course you had the Russian-Japanese War. You had the Russian Revolution shortly after that. 17 capitalist armies invaded. Tens of thousands of international troops were sent to try to overturn the revolution. And then, of course, you had World War II, in which Nazi Germany invaded, again got to Moscow,
Right.
were only turned back in the winter by Siberian troops on horseback. And, of course, you had the heroic Battle of Stalingrad, which finally turned the Nazis back towards Germany. You had the siege of Leningrad for over 700 days, and other cities were laid siege to too. I was in Rostov-on-Don on the border of Donetsk, which also was under siege for, I believe, around 2 years, so about the same amount of time as Leningrad. People can't understand the feeling that Russians have about being invaded again. And so once you understand that and you understand the reality that I think, yes, the West is bent on Russia's destruction, it puts things into very different perspective. But that's why people, by and large, do support Putin and do support the conflict. The second largest party in Russia is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. They've been pushing for Russia to intervene since 2014.
Right.
So, yeah, anyway, I
How
would say he has strong support.
Okay, how would you respond? I don't agree with this, but I hear this on the Facebook left and just about everywhere, that we shouldn't take a side. Both Russia and the U.S. are capitalist, imperialist countries, and the working class doesn't have a stake in this. I disagree, but what would be your response to this?
I disagree
Yeah,
very strongly. I think that the battle has been joined between the East and the West. I think what is happening in Ukraine is the culmination in the end of the unipolar world that the U.S. created after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a unipolar world in which the U.S. ran amok throughout the world, starting wars whenever it felt like it. None of the wars were wars that were necessary. They were all wars of choice. The U.S. destroyed entire nations,
right.
entire regions. And I think Russia will put that to an end. That's what I think. And this idea, I have good friends, good communist friends who say the same thing. Well, Russia's imperialist too. First of all, I don't agree that they are. Certainly not in the same way the U.S. is, but I don't even think that answers the question. Again, during World War II, the U.S. and Great Britain were imperialists, but we were rooting for them to defeat the Nazis. I mean, it doesn't end the argument. I think that there are really Nazis in Ukraine. I think they were bent on Russia's destruction and being supported by the U.S. to destroy Russia. And I think to that extent, Russia, had the right to go after them and to defend themselves. And, that's what I think. And I think I myself agree with Vijay Prashad, who said, look, there's one imperialism in the world. It's American imperialism.
Right.
And that I strongly believe that. And I think these leftist claims that, this is just an imperialist war are just silly.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I see your point. You were in the Donbas?
Yes, it was in Donetsk.
Okay, Donetsk. What was your impression of Donetsk?
I mean, I was very impressed with it. I was very impressed with the people who've been fighting since 2014 against, the radical right government in Kiev and its Nazi allies. And, I found a people resolved to fight, to defend themselves, to defend also the notion of the Soviet Union, which I found very interesting. People openly talked about that, about the ethos of the Soviet Union and the idea that, they were one people despite having different ethnicities and languages and regions, and how really, the government in Kiev tried to destroy that ethos, that, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that the people in Donetsk really see themselves as fighting that battle, fighting against fascism, fighting again for the best ideals of the Soviet Union. And I was very impressed with that.
Interesting. And so some people say like the Nazis in Ukraine are kind of like the oligarchs' insurance policy against the legacy of a 100-year-old revolution in a way. Like the Soviet Union, despite all its problems, it was a worker state, or supposed to be a worker state, and people lived like surrounded by that. So, did you contact or meet up with the Novorussian left or the left in Donetsk and elsewhere? And what's your take on them?
Yes, I mean, I met with various leftists there. Again, people who consider themselves Soviet people, not Russians, not Ukrainians, Soviet people. And yeah, I mean, they agree with what you're saying. I mean, I think fascism is a capitalist creation, or basically fascism is the last desperate form capitalism takes to defend itself. And that was true in World War II, and it's true today. And the U.S. has used fascism and Nazis even after World War II to defend capitalism in places like Greece, in Latin America, right? Most notably places like Argentina, Chile, in South Africa, of course, under apartheid. Fascism is a capitalist manifestation and an oligarch manifestation. It's true in Ukraine, but it's always true.
Okay, right. I don't agree with this, but I hear this a lot also on some parts to the left, that Russia is fascist too. There's Yale historian Timothy Snyder is basically making his career out of this, that they're Russian fascists, that but the Wagner Group is supposedly fascist. I don't see it. When I lived in Moscow in the late 90s for 3 years, there were fascist or ultranationalist groups there. The government clamped down on that really hard and has suppressed it. But what's your take on that? People claim Russia's fascist or ultranationalist too.
I just think, again, that's absurd. I mean, again, you have to go back to the history that the USSR was invaded by Nazi Germany.
Right.
Lost 27 million people defeating Nazi Germany.
Right.
In every city, every town in Russia, there are monuments to World War II. and the monuments are celebrating the defeat of fascism, right?
Right.
The idea that Russia's it's just completely anomalous
Right.
for
Right.
Russia. Putin grew up in Leningrad during the siege. You know, his family suffered under the siege by Nazi Germany.
Supposedly he had an older brother who starved to death in that
I
siege.
believe that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, again, this idea, it's just not even in the mentality of Russia.
Right.
You know, in Donetsk, for example, and I didn't even know this, so I went to Donetsk. In Donetsk City, there's a monument to the second largest mass grave of the Nazis, 75,000 people. Their bodies were thrown into this big pit by the Nazis, some of them alive. And there's a big monument to that. Again, when you experience that and when like your grandparents lived through that,
Yeah.
that feels like yesterday to these people.
Right.
They are fighting fascism. They are not fascist. It is just a slur. It is just a projection, honestly, of the West. The West always accuses others of doing what it's doing, right? It says, oh, you shouldn't invade other countries, like, you know, as NATO,
Yes, does
you
that all
know, invades the next country. Yeah, it's NATO that has been supporting fascism, not Russia.
right.
Look, that's not to say that there isn't a certain social conservatism in Russia. There is, represented by the Orthodox Church, but that isn't fascism. And you know, those things have to be distinguished.
Right. Interesting. Right. How do you see the situation, the Ukraine war, playing out? What do you think the end game is? How long do you think it'll continue? And people, but two things: people believe Russia is planning a major offensive. The partial mobilization, and apparently Putin had several meetings with the military leadership. They're planning on a major expansion of the military. The Russian military, they probably think they have to. How do you see this playing out? What do you think is going to happen?
I think, first of all, the initial goal of the operation that began in February was to liberate the Donbas, you know,
Nope.
this eastern part of Ukraine.
Right.
And I think that could have been done, and apparently there was an agreement in March, in principle, between Russia and Ukraine that could have ended the conflict,
Mm-hmm.
and that Boris Johnson was sent to Kiev to tell Zelensky not to sign the deal. But once that deal broke down and NATO has continued to send tens of billions of dollars of armaments to Ukraine, I think now the goal's changed. I mean, I do think that Russia will engage in a major military operation that will certainly get rid of the government in Kiev.
Right.
I think Russia will certainly ultimately hold on to the four republics that had referendums in September to join Russia and Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Poland will come in and take part of the Western Ukraine, and I think there'll be very little left of what we know as Ukraine.
Right.
And that's the result of, of the doing of the West and NATO, which decided it was going to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Sadly, they may get their wish.
Right. Lindsey Graham, a couple of months ago, had this weird statement that, Ukrainians are brave fighters. They'll fight to the last man. He's making sure that they do.
Yeah, no, it's sick. It's sick. The U.S. doesn't care about Ukraine, doesn't care about Ukrainians. Russia does, actually. Russia sees people in Ukraine as their brothers and sisters. Do you know 3 Soviet premiers were Ukrainian?
Khrushchev was one, and yeah.
Khrushchev was one who gave Crimea back to Ukraine. And that's why they've gone so slowly in Ukraine. They could have won this a long time ago.
Right.
But the West doesn't care about Ukraine, and they are willing to, fight to the last Ukrainian. And that's the sad part of all this.
Right. Now, a couple months ago, Poroshenko said that about Minsk II agreements, that we didn't really mean it. We just did it to buy time. And Angela Merkel recently several times reiterated that. There's debate about what she meant exactly, but it seems the message is to the Russians like no agreement with the West is possible.
No agreement with the West is possible, and Russia's realized this. Russia really did want, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia thought it would be readmitted to the West.
Right.
And that never happened. Not because Russia didn't want to, but because the West never wanted them part of the West.
Uh-huh.
Because the West always wanted not just to destroy the Soviet Union, but to destroy Russia itself.
Right.
And now that's very evident. And yes, finally, Russia has learned the hard way. The West lies. And you cannot trust the West. If you want security, you're going to have to make it yourself. And that's where we're at.
Right, right. Interesting. Now, do you see possibility of this escalating? Like back in October, there was a very tense situation for a while, the Kerch Bridge bombing, the Nord Stream 2 bombing. There was talk of using tactical nukes. Russians thought there was a possibility of a dirty bomb, false flag, and they apparently took it very seriously. So tensions seemed to ratchet up around October. Then Blinken and Sullivan and so on said, well, we're open to negotiations. They didn't mean it, of course, but it seems to me the end game, sadly, is a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. I really hope not, but how do you see this something like this happening?
I think it very possibly could happen. I mean, I think people in the U.S. need to do everything they can to prevent that.
Right.
I think there's divisions in the ruling class over that. I think there are some who definitely want that. I think a lot of those people happen to be in the U.S. State Department. Yeah. I think the Pentagon is not as excited about that. I think we need to encourage those in the U.S. government who oppose this to be the ones to prevail.
Right.
But I think if they don't, yes, I do think a confrontation with the use of nuclear weapons is a real possibility, and people should be frightened by that. I'm shocked at how little people seem to care that is a possibility.
Right.
I mean, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, even as a child, I knew that nuclear war was a possibility and that was the gravest threat to humankind. And that has just been forgotten about, even though we're being told by the same people who were telling us then, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, that we're now closer to a nuclear war than we've ever been.
Right.
And yet there's so little concern for that.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's like, I mean, years ago during the two Iraq wars, there were demos in D.C. and New York. I went to zillion anti-war demonstrations back then. There was a large anti-war movement. It doesn't seem to exist now, or it's very, very marginal, very small movement. The left doesn't seem to be anywhere, really. I think the PSYOPs has co-opted the left in so many ways in the decades since then.
Well, I agree. I think, who really played the biggest role in that was Obama. I think that Obama was so popular amongst liberals and even parts of the left, even I fell for him for a while, that he got people used to war.
Yeah.
He invaded Libya. People cheerleaded that. He deported 3 million people. He used drone bombings and other types of bombings liberally. And there was not a peep because people trusted him. He got a Nobel Peace Prize within 9 months of being president. It was silliness.
Right.
But I think he was the one that got people primed for war, got liberals primed for war.
Yeah, right.
And now, as you say, there's no peace movement virtually. And that's tremendously sad.
Right. It seems to me that in the last 10 years or so, the security state, like the U.S. military-industrial complex, CIA, FBI, and so on, and most, not all, but most of Silicon Valley has coalesced around the Democratic Party. Not that the Republicans are horrible, too, of course, but seems to be like the Twitter drama is showing that. There was censoring. FBI was literally running Twitter and other security agencies, mostly on behalf of the Democratic Party. As strange as they're now the party of imperialism. It's kind of an odd role reversal.
No, it is a role reversal. As you say, the Republican Party has its own demons, of course, but there are stronger, I think, stronger parts of the Republican Party than in the Democratic Party that are against war. There's more of a tendency within the Republican Party to oppose war than in the Democratic Party, which is a strange thing,
Right.
as you say. Even Trump and his supporters represented that to some extent, at least in rhetoric, right? I'm not sure in practice Trump was any better, but he certainly spoke during his campaign about ending the endless wars, about a détente with Russia, even a détente with North Korea. And he was pilloried for that by the liberals, right? So yeah, there is a bit of a role reversal. You know, the American Conservative magazine is probably the most pro-peace magazine we have, and so it is very interesting. You're right. I think the Democratic Party now is the war party even more than the Republicans. Even though I do think within Congress, certainly the number of Republicans who oppose all this are small. I mean, there aren't that many, but there's probably more of them than there are Democrats, and it's very strange.
Right. It's interesting. I think partly the populist wing of the Republican Party, they have more skin in the game. There's their constituency, their kids are more liable to fight in the military. So like my theory is they have more skin in the game. They're more directly connected to it.
Well, that's an interesting observation. That may be part of it. I think also, if you're a true conservative and a true fiscal conservative, there's not many of those, right? But if you are one of those, you're going to be very upset about the nearly $1 trillion we spend on military every year, right? On needless wars, right? And on the wasteful expenditure of our treasure on wars and blood on wars. So I think, in a way, there's also sort of a natural, tendency in the conservative movement to focus on America first, right? That was Trump's whole slogan, right? And so they're more critical of this interventionist notion that the Democrats have, right? This messianic notion that we're going to go around the world and violently change the world, and the Republicans are like, well, how about we just, tend to our own garden here, which again would be a natural conservative tendency, though again, I think most conservatives are conservative in name only, just like most liberals are liberals in name only. But I think that's another aspect to all this too.
Right, interesting. How do you see the development of a possible anti-war movement in the U.S. or revival of the left? Do you see this happening, or how do you see this happening if it does happen?
I think it will not happen under a Democrat. I think that they will give Biden a pass, largely.
Yeah.
I think it would only happen under a Republican. If a Republican's elected and continued these wars, then as a contrarian measure, people would come out on the streets to oppose war. That's what I think. I'm sorry, that sounds cynical, but that's what I see.
Yeah.
I mean, liberals seem to be all for standing for Ukraine and standing for Biden and supporting Ukraine. I don't see them taking a stand while he's in office.
Right, interesting. The Black Lives Matter, BLM movement, the protest exploded under Trump, not under this guy. They probably wouldn't have happened under Biden.
Well, correct. I mean, black people are still being shot by police.
It didn't change anything. Yeah, it didn't
change nothing. Yeah. Immigrants are still being deported. Haitians are being deported in huge numbers. Again, no peep. You have a country, I'm sorry, where people lack principles, right? If their guy does it, it's fine, right? Now, why is it their guy then, right? Now, that's the question, right? It's now just like rooting for a football team.
Right.
And in the same way as rooting for a football team, Jerry Seinfeld joked, football teams move cities all the time, right? So you're really just rooting for a color. That was his joke. Well, that's the same thing here too, right? I mean, These parties have no principles. They don't stand for anything. So if you're supporting one or the other of the parties, you're not supporting a principle to begin with. You're just rooting for the home team that you think is the home team. The donkey versus the elephant. I mean, it's silly time in America.
It's like team sports, yeah.
Yeah.
Team sports. Interesting. Change of subject slightly. What's your take on what's happening in Brazil with the election of Lula? I have a feeling people may be disappointed in him, but Glenn Greenwald's written some interesting stuff about him.
Yeah, well, look, I think he's an improvement over Bolsonaro.
Yeah.
No matter what, I think he'll be much more attentive to trying to protect the rainforest. Which if that's all he did, it'd be great for the world. I think he will be, more progressive. I don't know if Lula 2 will be as progressive as Lula 1, but we'll just have to see. And look, in the end, it comes down to the movement behind him, what they force him to do.
Mm.
And again, I think that's the thing Americans don't understand. That the president and your leaders will be as progressive as you force them to be.
Mm.
Nixon was much more progressive than Obama, for example.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Not because he was a progressive guy, but because there was a movement forcing him to do that, right? And Roosevelt used to say, force me to do it. That's what Americans don't understand about politics. They think if they elect their guy, they can go to seat for 4 years and he'll take care of everything, or she'll take care of everything. But that's just not true, right? So, but Brazilians understand that, right? And I think that, the movement there hopefully will hold his feet to the fire.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, they haven't done that with Obama or Biden. Like Biden couldn't even raise the federal minimum wage as the Senate parliamentarian, which is a job which no one even heard of.
That was disgusting. Yeah, and of course, with abortion, the Democrats keep saying, vote for us to save abortion. What have they done to save abortion?
Yeah, they liked having the Supreme Court as a political football for year after year after year, and then this is the result.
And they won't protect abortion, which they could through congressional conduct.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they want that political football. They are totally cynical.
Yeah.
They're totally cynical. And people don't see it. They don't see it. And so they cast a vote almost for symbolic purposes. Oh, I'm voting for Roe v. Wade, even though, no, you're not really, but you've been convinced that, you are if you vote for a Democrat. But it's just, the political sophistication of the American people is just, it's childlike. It's at about a third grade level.
Right, that's about it, yeah. Caitlin Johnstone said the American people are the most heavily indoctrinated people on the planet. She's probably right.
Noam Chomsky has said that too. They are. I mean, there's no question about that. No question. They don't read. I mean, because they don't know anything. I mean, that's why they're so easily indoctrinated. They don't know anything. Yeah. They don't know about the last war we fought. They don't know about Ukraine. They didn't even know what Ukraine was till February.
All these people with Ukrainian flags in their front lawn, where were they when the Donbas was being bombed?
Exactly.
And they probably literally never heard of Ukraine or have no idea where it was.
They still can't find it on a map. No, absolutely.
They still can't find it on the map, yeah. Right. It's sad. So are you overall optimistic or pessimistic, or it's hard to tell?
Oh, I'm optimistic.
Yeah, okay.
There's a Chinese curse. I guess they attribute it to the Chinese. May you live in interesting times. But you know what? I don't think it's a curse. It's a blessing. We live in interesting times.
Yeah.
Embrace it. I think things are going to change. They're going to change for the better. Look, it's not going to be easy. But yes, I'm optimistic. And I think if you're a revolutionary, by the way, you have to be optimistic. Because, and I think I just saw a quote. I think it was, I forget who it was by. But the quote was, an intelligent person can hold opposite ideas in their mind at one time. You can be realistic about the difficulties confronting humankind, and maybe even the futility of changing the world. But unless you have a certain amount of optimism that the world could be changed, why would you even try, right? I mean, so Yeah, I'm optimistic, and I'm happy. I'm happy about the chance to struggle. I mean, I think you have to enjoy the struggle. I'll just give one last anecdote, I guess. I just had this very long trip to and through Russia. I spent about 22 hours on trains in Russia, about 25 hours in cars going around Russia. And of course, the flights were long. And I tell people, and the people are like, oh, that sounds exhausting. And I'm like, hey, I've learned if I'm going to be a traveler, which I like to be, I'm going to enjoy the traveling part, right? If you can't enjoy the traveling part, then don't travel.
Right.
And I think that is a metaphor for life. You can't worry about getting to your destination. Enjoy the way there. And if you do that, then you're always going to be happy, and you're always going to be a happy activist because you're going to enjoy the process of activism. So that is my 2 cents.
Interesting take. Yes, good. Very wise. This Gramsci quote: "Optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect," or
Yes,
like that.
yes, perfect.
Well, okay. Well, I'm gonna have to go. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
That's all. I enjoyed speaking with you, Kate. You're very insightful, had great questions, and I appreciate you.
Thank you. Now, where can people go to find your work?
Well, they can go to Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik. I have a number of books on skyhorsepublishing.com,
Okay.
and I have a new book coming out by Clarity Press on Nicaragua.
Okay, and I'll provide a link to your website, which has a lot of stuff on it.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for your time. Thank you.
Be well.
Bye bye.
Das Vidania. Bye-bye.
До свидания.